My name is Gary Morrow, and I want to tell you about the Tuesday morning when my CEO fired me in front of 60 people and didn't realize until 10 days later that he had just put an $800 million deal in serious danger. I had been at Duralin Supply Solutions for 22 years, not 22 months, 22 years. I knew that building the way some people know their own homes. I knew where the problems were hiding. I knew which vendor agreements had landmines buried in the fine print. I knew which clients picked up the phone when I called and which ones let it go to voicemail when anyone else did. I had built something real inside that company, quietly, without making a lot of noise about it. None of that mattered on that Tuesday morning in March. Preston Cole had called what he liked to call an alignment meeting. That was his phrase. Alignment meeting. It meant everyone stopped what they were doing, walked into the main conference room, and sat there while Preston told us what direction the company was heading. I had attended maybe a dozen of these since he took over. They were usually about vision statements and growth targets and new initiatives with names that didn't mean much once the meeting was over. I expected this one to be the same. I was wrong. There were about 60 people in that room. Department heads, regional managers, junior analysts, support staff. The whole mix. I sat near the back the way I usually did. I had my notebook with me out of habit, though I rarely wrote anything down at these things anymore. Preston started the way he always started. Confident. Easy smile. Talking about Duralin's future and the new era the company was stepping into. I had heard this part before. Then he said something about how transformations require hard decisions. That some roles that made sense in the past don't make sense going forward. That real leadership means having the courage to restructure even when it's uncomfortable. I still didn't think he was talking about me. Then he said my name. Gary Morrow's role as Senior Director of Vendor Contracts will be eliminated, effective immediately. That was it. No phone call the night before. No private meeting that morning. No warning of any kind. Just my name, spoken out loud, in front of 60 people who all went very still at the same time. He kept talking. He said that vendor contracts and procurement operations would be restructured under a new leadership model built for the next phase of Duralin's growth. Then he turned slightly to his left and introduced the person who would be taking over, a 34-year-old named Kyle Harmon. Kyle had been at the company for 11 months. 11 months. He had come in from one of Preston's consulting firms, had a clean haircut and a firm handshake, and had spent most of his time here attending meetings and building slide decks. Kyle stood up from his chair and actually smiled at the room. Not a nervous smile, a proud one, like someone who had just been handed a trophy. I sat there for a moment. I want to be honest about that. I sat there and I felt it. The heat in my face, the strange quiet that comes when something humiliating happens in public. I could feel people not looking at me, which was somehow worse than if they had stared. But I did not say a word. I picked up my notebook. I pushed my chair back. I nodded once, not at Preston, just at the room in general, and I walked out. My footsteps were the only sound in that hallway. And as I pushed through the door and stepped outside into the cold March air, one thought settled into my mind. Not anger, not panic, something quieter than both of those. Preston Cole had just fired the one person whose signature was legally required to close the Vescor deal. $800 million. 5-year national distribution contract. 14 days from signing. My name was in that contract. Not as a courtesy, not as a formality, as the authorized co-signatory, embedded in the legal framework, tied to my certifications and my professional standing and 9 years of trust one had built with the other side of that table. Preston didn't know that yet, but he was going to find out. I want to back up for a minute, because if you're going to understand what happened next, you need to understand what I had actually built inside that company and what it cost me to build it. I joined Duralin Supply Solutions when I was 28 years old. Entry level. Junior procurement analyst. The company was a lot smaller then, and it was still run by the man who had started it, a guy named Walt Duralin. Walt was old school in the best way. He ran the business on relationships, hard work, and strict operational standards. He didn't care about your degree. He cared about whether you showed up, did the work right, and kept your word. That environment made sense to me. I had grown up watching my father run a small parts supplier out of a warehouse, so I already understood that the details were where things either held together or fell apart. Over the next several years, I learned everything I could. Vendor law, supply chain compliance, multi-state licensing requirements, contract structures. I read master agreements the way other people read novels. I learned which clauses protected the company and which ones left it exposed. I learned how to negotiate with suppliers who had been in business longer than I had been alive. I made mistakes and I corrected them, and I learned from both. By my mid-40s, I was the senior director of vendor contracts. I had personally negotiated or co-signed more than 200 major vendor agreements across 12 states. I had relationships with procurement officers at our 10 largest clients. Real relationships built on years of follow-through and honest dealing. These were people who trusted me not because I was charming, but because I had never once let them down on something that mattered. I was not the most visible person at Duralin. I was not the one giving speeches at industry conferences or getting featured in logistics trade publications. I drove a used Jeep that had 140,000 miles on it. I brought my lunch from home most days. On Saturdays, I coached youth basketball for my daughter's old age group at the community center, just because I liked it. My life outside that office was simple, and it was mine. Renee, my wife, had gone back to school part-time. She was finishing a program she had paused years earlier when we had our daughter, and I was proud of her for going back. Our daughter, Mia, was finishing her second year of college. The tuition was real. The mortgage was real. I was carrying those things quietly, the way you do when you've accepted that that's your job and you don't complain about it because it's your family and you chose it. I was not desperate. I want to be clear about that. I had savings. I had options. But I had also spent 2 decades inside one company, building something that only I fully understood how to operate. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I had made the mistake of believing that made me safe. I had confused being essential with being valued. Those are not the same thing. I know that now. I didn't know it fully then. When Preston Cole said my name in that conference room, I was 49 years old. I had given more than half my working life to Duralin Supply Solutions, and it had taken him about 30 seconds to remove me from the building. That's the part that stays with you, not the anger, the math of it. 30 seconds, 22 years. To understand how I ended up in that conference room, you have to understand how Preston Cole ended up running Duralin in the first place. About 2 years before he fired me, Walt Duralin made a decision that a lot of founders make when they get older and the offers get big enough. He sold a controlling stake in the company to a private equity group called Fortbridge Capital. I don't blame Walt for that. He had spent 30 years building something from nothing, and he was in his late 60s, and the number Fortbridge put on the table was serious. I probably would have done the same thing. But when Fortbridge came in, everything changed. Not all at once. Slowly. The way a tide comes in, you don't notice it until the water is already at your ankles. Fortbridge's plan was straightforward. They wanted to modernize Duralin, cut the parts of the business that weren't producing fast returns, and position the company for either a major acquisition or an IPO within 3 to 5 years. To do that, they needed a different kind of CEO. Someone who spoke their language. Someone who could move fast, make the numbers look right, and sell a vision to a boardroom. That person was Preston Cole. Preston was 41 when he took over. He had an MBA from a school with a name people recognized. He dressed well, spoke clearly, and had the kind of confidence that reads as competence until you get close enough to test it. He walked into Duralin like he already knew the place, which was interesting because he had never worked a single day in logistics or supply chain or vendor operations in his life. His background was in corporate strategy and financial restructuring. That's a real skill set. It just wasn't the skill set Duralin actually needed at the operational level. I tried to make it work. In the first few months after Preston arrived, I requested 3 separate meetings with him to walk him through the vendor contract structure, the key client relationships, and the compliance requirements we operated under. He showed up on time. He nodded in the right places. He asked questions that sounded informed. But then the follow-up would come, and I'd realize the questions he was asking were the same ones I had already answered, which told me the information wasn't sticking. He wasn't ignoring me on purpose. He just wasn't prioritizing what I was telling him, because to him, contracts and compliance were background noise. He was focused on the bigger picture, the strategy, the growth story. Within 6 months, he had brought in 6 consultants from his previous firm. Smart people, some of them, but none of them knew Duralin. None of them knew the vendors, the clients, the history of how specific agreements have been structured and why. They knew how to build frameworks and run analyses and produce slide decks that looked impressive in board presentations. And Preston loved that. It was the language he was comfortable in. Senior people started leaving. Some were pushed out. Some saw what was coming and left before it arrived. I watched colleagues I had worked alongside for a decade walk out of that building with boxes. Each time, I told myself I was different. I was too embedded, too important to the actual operations. And for a while, that was true. Then came the Vestcor deal. Durolin had been working toward this contract for nearly 3 years before Preston arrived. It was an $800 million, 5-year national distribution agreement with Vestcor Retail Group, one of the largest supply chain buyers in the country. The deal had been built carefully, relationship by relationship, clause by clause. I had been the operational lead on the vendor compliance side from the beginning, and when the contract framework was first formally structured and submitted for board approval, my name had been written into it. Gary Morrow, Senior Director of Vendor Contracts, as the authorized co-signatory on Durolin's behalf. Preston didn't fully understand what that meant. Kyle Harmon, his new favorite with 11 months of experience, had no idea at all. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was panicking, more because my mind wouldn't stop working through things quietly, the way it does when a problem is big enough to deserve real attention. By morning, something had settled in me, a kind of stillness. Renee came downstairs and found me at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of documents I had pulled from my personal files the night before. She looked at me the way she always does when she's trying to figure out where my head is. She asked if I was okay. I told her yes, and I meant it. She sat down across from me and didn't say anything else right away, which is one of the things I have always loved about her. She knows when I need to think out loud and when I need quiet. That morning, I needed quiet. I want to explain something now, because this is the part of the story where the whole situation starts to look very different. When the Vestcor deal was first being structured, this was nearly 2 years before Preston arrived. Durolin and Vestcor's legal teams spent months negotiating the framework of the agreement. Big deals like this don't just cover price and delivery terms. They cover governance. They cover who has authority to make decisions on each side. They cover what happens if key personnel change. That last part is important. The final contract framework, as approved by the previous Durolin board, named me, Gary Morrow, Senior Director of Vendor Contracts, as the authorized procurement co-signatory for Durolin Supply Solutions. This wasn't just a title on a document. It was a legal designation tied to my professional certifications, my standing in the vendor compliance structure, and critically, my established relationship with the person on Vestcor's side who held the equivalent role. That person was Don Fielder. Don was Vestcor's head of vendor compliance. I had worked with him for 9 years. We had been through 3 major contract negotiations together before the Vestcor deal even started. He knew how I worked. He trusted my judgment. That trust was not a small thing. It was part of why Vestcor had been willing to move forward with Durolin at this scale in the first place. Now here is what Preston did not understand. Under the terms of the Vestcor agreement, any change to the authorized signatory on Durolin's side required 60 days of written notice to Vestcor's legal team. Not a phone call, not an email, formal written notice. And after that notice, Vestcor's board had to review and formally reapprove the change before it could take effect. That process existed because Vestcor had insisted on it during negotiations. They were committing to an $800 million relationship. They wanted to know exactly who they were dealing with on the other side, and they wanted the right to weigh in if that changed. The deal was 14 days from closing. 60 days notice. 14 days left. That math did not work in Preston's favor. And I had not told him that. Not because I was hiding it. He had never asked. He had fired me in a conference room in front of 60 people without ever sitting down to think through what my signature actually meant to the most important contract in Durolin's history. I looked at the documents on the kitchen table. My certified copies, which I had every right to keep. I had been meticulous about that over the years, keeping proper records, maintaining copies of agreements I had personally negotiated or signed. It was just habit. Good professional habit. Don had actually called me 2 weeks earlier, before all of this happened, to mention informally that he had heard some rumblings about management changes at Durolin and hoped things were stable on our end. I had reassured him at the time. Now I sat there thinking about that call. I did not pick up the phone and call Preston. I did not call anyone at Duralin. I did not call a lawyer yet. I just sat there with my coffee and my documents and the quiet kitchen around me. I was not planning revenge. I want to be clear about that. I was not sitting there rubbing my hands together. I was simply a man who understood what was true, and who had decided to stop pretending that the people who had just humiliated him deserved his protection. That was a different thing entirely. The first 2 days after the firing, nothing happened. No calls from Duralin. No emails. Just silence, which told me they were scrambling internally and hadn't figured out what to say to me yet. I used those 2 days to get organized. I went through my documents carefully. I made sure everything I needed was in order. I contacted my accountant to understand where we stood financially. The answer was that we were okay. Not comfortable indefinitely, but okay for a meaningful stretch of time. That helped me think more clearly. Pressure makes people make bad decisions. I didn't want to be pressured into anything. Day 3 is when things started to move. I got a call that afternoon from a woman named Priya. She was a junior contracts analyst at Duralin, smart, careful, one of the few people on my former team who actually understood the work at a technical level. She wasn't calling from a company line. She was calling from her personal cell phone. She told me right away that she wasn't authorized to share anything official and that I should know she was calling as a person, not as an employee. I appreciated that. I told her I understood. She said that since the morning after my firing, Cal Harmon had been in back-to-back closed-door meetings with Preston and a representative from Fort Bridge Capital. She didn't know everything they were discussing, but she had overheard enough to know that the phrase being used in those meetings was the signature situation. She said the energy in those rooms was not calm. She said Cal looked like someone who had been handed a problem he didn't know how to solve, which was accurate because he had been. I thanked Priya. I told her to take care of herself and not to take any risks on my behalf. She said she just thought I should know. I believed her. Day 5 brought something more formal. A letter arrived from Duralin's legal team. It was carefully worded, the way legal letters are when lawyers are trying to accomplish something they're not entirely sure they can accomplish. The letter stated that as part of my separation from the company, I was required to formally transfer my role responsibilities, and it included an attached form. The form was designed to retroactively reassign my signatory authority to Kyle Harmon for the purposes of the Vestcor agreement. I read it twice. Then I called a contract attorney named Phil Garrett. I had known Phil for about 8 years. He had helped me review a few personal business matters over the years, and I trusted his judgment. I drove to his office that same afternoon and put the letter and the form on his desk. Phil read everything quietly. It took him about 40 minutes. Then he took his glasses off and looked at me and said what I already suspected. The form Duralin's legal team had sent was not enforceable against the existing Vestcor contract. The original agreement controlled. The terms of that agreement had been negotiated and signed by both parties, and those terms specified the process for changing authorized signatories. A form generated after the fact by the departing party's legal team did not override that process. Not even close. He said it simply. They can't paper their way out of this one, Gary. I nodded. I told him to hold on to everything and to be available over the next week or so. He said he would be. Day 8 changed the temperature of the whole situation. My phone rang in the early afternoon. I looked at the screen and saw a number I recognized immediately. It was Don Fielder. Don was not calling Duralin. He was calling me. Directly. On my personal number, which he had had for years. I answered, and we exchanged the kind of brief, warm greeting that people who have worked together a long time exchange. Then Don got to the point. He had heard that there had been some leadership changes at Duralin. He asked carefully if everything was okay on my end. I made a decision in that moment. I was not going to be dishonest with Don. He deserved better than that, and honestly, the truth was going to surface on its own within days regardless of what I said. I told him I had been let go, effective immediately, about a week prior. Don went quiet, not the brief quiet of someone gathering their thoughts. A longer quiet, the kind that means something is being recalculated. Then he spoke. He told me that when Vestcor's board had approved moving forward with the Duralin deal at this scale, my involvement had been a material factor in their comfort level. The board knew my name. They had reviewed my professional record as part of their due diligence. Don said he was going to need to bring this development back to his team and that Vestcor would likely need to reassess their position. I told him I understood completely. I thanked him for calling me directly. He said, of course, and that he hoped things worked out for me. When I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and let the silence sit for a minute. Day 10, Preston called. I saw his name on my screen, and I let it ring twice before I answered. His voice was different from the last time I had heard it, the day he said my name in that conference room. The confidence was still there, but it had a careful edge to it now. He said he thought it might be a good idea for us to sit down and talk. He said there might be a way to make things work for both sides. He was choosing his words the way someone does when they've been coached to be cautious. I told him I would think about it. He said he hoped I would. I hung up and looked out the window for a long moment. 14 days had seemed like a long time when this started. Now there were 4 days left, and Preston Cole was calling my personal cell phone asking if we could talk. I had not raised my voice once. I had not made a single threat. I had simply waited while reality did what reality does when it's been ignored long enough. It catches up. I called Preston back the next morning and told him I was willing to meet. I kept it short. I said I would bring my attorney, and that if he wanted this conversation to be productive, he should bring his as well. He agreed without hesitation, which told me how serious things had become on his end. We agreed on a neutral location, a conference room inside a hotel about 2 miles from the Durlin offices. Not their building, not a restaurant where the setting would feel casual and easy. A proper room with a table. Professional. I wanted the tone to be right from the start. I dressed the way I always dressed for important meetings during my time at Durlin. Plain dark suit. No tie. Clean shoes. Nothing flashy. I was not trying to impress anyone. I was trying to be exactly who I had always been, a man who took his work seriously and showed up prepared. When I walked into that conference room, I read it in about 5 seconds. Preston was already seated. He looked like he had not slept well in several days. The sharpness that he usually carried, that polished, in-control energy he walked into every room with, was still there on the surface, but underneath it something was worn down. His attorney, a senior partner from a firm I recognized, sat to his left with a legal pad in front of him. A third man sat slightly back from the table, a representative from Fort Bridge Capital, which told me the private equity group was now directly involved in managing the situation. That was a significant detail. Kyle Harmon was not in the room. That absence said more than any introduction could have. 4 days ago, Kyle was the future of Durlin's procurement division. Today, he wasn't in the room where the actual problem was being solved. That's how fast things shift when reality arrives. Phil Garrett, my attorney, sat beside me. He had a folder in front of him and a calm expression that I found reassuring. The Durlin attorney opened. He explained that the company valued Gary's long tenure and his contributions, and that given the timing of certain ongoing business matters, Durlin believed there was an opportunity for a mutually beneficial short-term arrangement. He used careful language throughout. Words like facilitate and transition support and cooperative resolution. What he was describing, underneath all of it, was simple. They needed me to show up and sign the Vestcor deal, and they needed to find a way to make that happen without admitting openly how badly they had miscalculated. I let him finish. I did not interrupt. I did not react visibly. I just listened. Then Phil spoke. He laid out the legal reality in plain, direct terms. My employment had been terminated. My signatory authority under the Vestcor agreement could not be unilaterally reassigned within the time frame remaining. The original contract terms governed the process, and that process had not been followed. Durlin had no legal mechanism to compel my participation. Any path forward would need to be negotiated voluntarily, on terms I agreed to. The room was very quiet after Phil finished. I looked at Preston for the first time since sitting down. He met my eyes, and for the first time in the 2 years I had worked under him, I saw something in his expression that I had never seen there before. He didn't have an answer ready. He didn't have a reframe or a pivot or a confident summary of why things were actually fine. He just sat there, and the weight of what he had done carelessly, without thinking it through, was visible on his face. I spoke. I kept my voice even. I told him that I wanted the Vestcor deal to close. That was true. I had spent 3 years helping build that deal, and I didn't want to see it fall apart. But I was not going to participate without being compensated fairly and without being treated like a professional, something that had not happened in that conference room 11 days ago. Then I told him what I needed: a formal consulting contract with a fee structure that reflected the actual value of what I was providing. A written letter from Duralin's board that corrected the record on my departure. Something that acknowledged my contributions honestly and did not leave a false professional narrative behind me. And a severance payment that reflected 22 years of real work, not the minimum they had originally planned to offer. I was not asking for my job back. That was done, and I knew it, and I had accepted it. I was asking to be paid for what I was worth, which was something that should have happened long before any of this. Preston looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the Fort Bridge representative. The Fort Bridge representative gave a small nod. The negotiation that followed took about 90 minutes. It was detailed and at times tense, but it stayed professional throughout. No one raised their voice. No one made threats. We worked through the specifics line by line until we had something that all parties could agree to. When it was done, I shook hands with everyone in the room, even Preston. He held my hand for a half-second longer than necessary, and I think in that moment he understood something that he probably should have understood a long time ago. Some people are not replaceable by someone with a better haircut and 11 months of experience. Sometimes you find that out at the worst possible time. I signed the consulting agreement 2 days later after Phil had reviewed the final language and confirmed everything was in order. It was clean. It said what it needed to say, and it protected me the way I needed to be protected. I signed it at Phil's office, not at Duralin's building. That detail mattered to me, even if it didn't matter to anyone else. The first thing I did after signing was call Don Fielder. I told him that things were being handled on the Duralin side, and that I would be personally involved in facilitating the close of the Vestcor agreement in my capacity as a consultant. Don was professional about it. He asked a few specific questions about the nature of my new arrangement and what my role would be going forward. I answered everything honestly and directly, the way I always had with him. He said he appreciated the clarity and that he would bring the update back to Vestcor's team. Over the next several days, I worked through the documentation carefully. I provided my certifications. I answered the questions that Vestcor's legal team sent over. I had a long call with Don and 2 members of Vestcor's compliance group where we went through the final terms of the agreement section by section. It was familiar work I had done many times before. The difference was that now I was doing it from a position that was entirely honest about what I was and what I was there to do. On the scheduled closing date, I was not at a celebration dinner. I was not standing in a room somewhere with a glass raised. I was at Phil's office, on a conference call with Vestcor's legal team and Duralin's attorney, going through the formal signatory process. It was deliberate and methodical and quiet, the way the most important work usually is when it's done right. When the final confirmation came through, there was a brief moment where everyone on the call said the necessary professional things. Then most people dropped off. Don stayed on for an extra moment. He said he hoped that wherever I ended up next, the people there would know what they had. I thanked him. He said take care, and then he was gone too. I sat back in the chair in Phil's conference room and looked at the ceiling for a moment. $800 million. 5 years of national distribution. 3 years of building toward a finish line. It had crossed, and I had been part of making it cross, not because I was forced to, but because I had chosen to, on my own terms, for fair compensation, with my professional record intact. Duralin got its deal. Fort Bridge Capital got its milestone. Preston Cole got the press release he had been waiting for. I got my consulting fee, a number that reflected what 22 years of real knowledge and 14 days of serious urgency are actually worth when the people who need you no longer have the option of pretending otherwise. I got the written letter from Duralin's board, and I got a severance check that finally matched what I had actually contributed to that company over 2 decades. I also got something I hadn't specifically asked for, but valued more than any of the rest of it. My professional record was clean. My reputation with the people who mattered in my industry was not only intact, it was stronger, because the people on the other side of that table had seen exactly who I was under pressure. Kyle Harmon left Duralin voluntarily about 4 months after all of this was settled. I heard about it through someone in my network. I didn't have a reaction to it, really. I had already moved on. In the months after the Vestcor deal closed, I gave myself some time. Not a long time. A few weeks where I didn't push hard in any particular direction. I took care of some things around the house that I had been putting off. I went back to coaching basketball on Saturday mornings. I had dinner with Renee more evenings than I had managed to in years, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying a work problem home with me every night. Renee finished her program that spring. I sat in the third row at the ceremony and watched her walk across the stage, and I felt something that I don't have a clean word for. Pride, obviously, but also something like relief. We had carried a lot of weight together over the years, and it had held. That mattered. About 6 weeks after the deal closed, I started getting calls. The first one came from a logistics company based in the Midwest, a direct competitor of Duralin, actually with a national footprint and a serious vendor operations division. Someone in their leadership had heard through the industry network about what had happened at Duralin, and more specifically, they had heard how it had resolved. They wanted to talk. A week after that, a second company reached out, a supply chain advisory group looking to build out a senior contracts practice. Word travels in procurement circles. The people who do this work at a serious level know each other. They know who the real operators are, and they notice when someone becomes available. I took my time with both conversations. I was not desperate, and I had promised myself after everything that had happened that I would not make a major professional decision from a place of pressure. I evaluated both opportunities carefully. I asked the right questions. I paid attention to how the people across the table from me communicated and what they valued. I accepted the offer from the Midwest Logistics Company. Senior advisory role. Compensation package that was meaningfully higher than anything Duralin had offered me at any point in 22 years. A role with real scope and real respect built into how it was structured from the start. The mortgage stayed current. Mia started her junior year without any interruption. The Jeep still runs. But I want to be honest about something, because this isn't really a story about money or even about the deal. Those things worked out, and I'm grateful for them. But the thing that actually changed for me was something quieter than any of that. For 22 years, I had made myself essential. I had learned more, stayed later, built deeper relationships, kept better records, and done more careful work than almost anyone around me. And I had done all of it while staying invisible in the ways that the company's leadership actually noticed. I told myself that the work was enough, that being essential was the same as being valued, that if I just kept my head down and delivered, the right people would eventually recognize what I had built. That was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally wrong. Being essential and being valued are two completely different things. One is about what you do. The other is about whether the people above you are paying enough attention to understand what they would lose if you were gone. And if they're not paying that attention, you cannot assume they'll figure it out before they make a costly mistake. You have to know your own value clearly. You have to document what you do. You have to build relationships outside your own building. You have to protect yourself professionally the way you protect your family. Not out of paranoia, but out of responsibility. And if someone fires you in a room full of 60 people without giving you the dignity of a private conversation first, that tells you something important. Not about your worth. About theirs. Sometimes the people who fire you are really just firing themselves. They just don't know it until the contract comes due. It's a Tuesday morning as I tell you this. I'm at my desk in my own office. Quiet outside. Coffee in front of me. A full day of real work ahead. I'm not starting over from nothing. I'm starting from everything I already knew.